The Wyoming sun beat down mercilessly on the sprawling Triple Crown Ranch as Catherine Morgan scrubbed the hardwood floors of the main house with hands that had grown calloused from years of labor. At 22, she carried herself with a quiet dignity that belied her station as a mere servant, her copper-colored hair tied back in a practical bun, her gray eyes focused intently on the task at hand. The Orphan train had brought her west 7 years ago, depositing her at the doorstep of Mrs. Henderson's boarding house in Cheyenne, with nothing but the tattered dress on her back and a small leather Bible that had belonged to her mother. Since then, Catherine had moved from one household to another, always the help, never the welcomed guest, scrubbing floors and washing linens for people who barely acknowledged her existence. But something about the Triple Crown Ranch felt different, though she couldn't quite name what it was. If you're enjoying this story, please subscribe to the channel and let us know in the comments what city you're watching from. James Garrett stood at the window of his study, his weathered hands clasped behind his back as he watched the young woman work through the open doorway. At 53, he had built an empire from nothing more than grit, determination, and an uncanny ability to spot good grazing land before anyone else. The Triple Crown Ranch stretched across 15,000 acres of prime Wyoming territory, supporting 3,000 head of cattle and employing over 40 ranch hands. His reputation as a shrewd businessman and fair employer had spread throughout the territory, earning him respect from governors and cattle barons alike. Yet for all his success, James Garrett was a profoundly lonely man, widowed for 12 years after consumption had claimed his beloved Eleanor, leaving him childless and emotionally barren in a house too large for one man. He had hired Catherine 3 months ago on the recommendation of Pastor Williams, who had vouched for her character and work ethic. But James had barely spoken more than a dozen words to her in all that time. The ranch house itself was a testament to James's success, a 2-story structure built from imported timber and local stone, with wide porches that wrapped around 3 sides and offered views of the Wind River Range to the west. Inside, the furnishings spoke of wealth acquired but not flaunted. Solid oak furniture crafted by skilled carpenters in Denver. Persian rugs purchased from a traveling merchant. Oil paintings of Western landscapes that captured the raw beauty of the frontier. The walls were lined with bookshelves containing volumes on cattle breeding, land management, and classical literature that James had taught himself to read and appreciate. A massive stone fireplace dominated the main living area, its mantel adorned with a single photograph of Eleanor, taken shortly before her death, her smile captured forever in sepia tones. The kitchen was equipped with the latest innovations, including a cast-iron stove imported from Chicago and running water pumped from the ranch's own well, luxuries that most frontier homes could only dream of possessing. Catherine had learned early in life that survival meant making oneself invisible, staying quiet, doing the work without complaint, and never, ever hoping for anything beyond the next meal and a place to sleep. The orphanage in Philadelphia had taught her that lesson with brutal efficiency, and the Orphan train had reinforced it during the long journey west. She remembered the way prospective families had looked over the children like livestock at auction, selecting the strong boys for farm work and the pretty girls for household service, leaving the plain or weak to travel further west to less desirable placements. Catherine had been chosen 3 times and returned twice, deemed too slow by one family and too educated by another who feared a literate servant might get ideas above her station. Mrs. Henderson had been kind enough, in her way, but she ran a business, not a charity, and Catherine had worked without wages in exchange for room and board until Pastor Williams had found her this position. The pay was modest but regular, and Mr. Garrett provided meals and a small room off the kitchen, which was more security than Catherine had ever known. The morning routine at the Triple Crown Ranch began before dawn, when Catherine would rise to light the stove and prepare breakfast for Mr. Garrett and whatever ranch hands might be working close to the house. She moved through the kitchen with practiced efficiency, mixing biscuit dough, frying bacon and eggs, and brewing strong coffee that could wake the dead. By the time James descended the stairs at 6 o'clock sharp, the table would be set, the food hot, and Catherine would retreat to the kitchen to eat her own smaller portion, standing at the counter. She would then clear the dishes, wash them in the large basin, and begin her daily cleaning routine that took her through every room of the house in a carefully planned rotation. The work was hard, but honest, and Catherine took pride in maintaining the high standards that Mr. Garrett seemed to expect, even if he never explicitly stated them. She had learned his preferences through observation. He liked his shirts starched just so, his study dusted, but with papers left exactly where he placed them, and his evening meals served at precisely 7 o'clock, with a clean tablecloth and polished silverware. What Catherine didn't know was that James Garrett had begun to notice her in ways that both surprised and disturbed him. He found himself listening for the soft sound of her footsteps in the morning, watching for the way sunlight caught in her hair when she hung laundry on the line, and appreciating the gentle humming she sometimes allowed herself when she thought no one could hear. It had been so long since another person had inhabited his space in any meaningful way that he had forgotten what it felt like to be aware of someone else's presence, to unconsciously adjust his movements to avoid crossing paths in the hallway, to wonder what someone else might be thinking or feeling. Eleanor had been gone so long that her memory had faded to an ache rather than a sharp pain, but James had never considered that another woman might someday occupy his thoughts. Catherine was young enough to be his daughter, a servant in his employ, and an orphan with no family or connections to protect her reputation. All reasons why any decent man should maintain strict propriety and emotional distance. The turning point came on a blustering October afternoon when James returned to the house earlier than expected. His business in town concluded more quickly than anticipated. He entered through the front door to find Catherine standing on a ladder in the parlor, reaching to dust the top of a high bookshelf, her face tilted upward in concentration. As he watched, the ladder wobbled on the uneven floorboard, and Catherine lost her balance with a small cry of alarm. James moved without thinking, crossing the room in 3 long strides to catch her as she fell, his arms closing around her waist as the feather duster tumbled to the floor. For a moment, they stood frozen, Catherine's hands gripping his shoulders for stability, her face mere inches from his own, her breath coming in quick gasps from the fright. Their eyes met, and in that instant, something passed between them that neither could name, but both felt in the very core of their being, a recognition that transcended words and social boundaries, a connection that seemed to have been waiting for precisely this moment to announce itself. Catherine recovered first, her cheeks flushing as she stammered an apology and tried to extricate herself from his embrace. James released her immediately, taking a step back and clearing his throat awkwardly as he tried to find words that seemed to have fled his mind entirely. They stood in uncomfortable silence for several seconds before James finally managed to ask if she was hurt, his voice rougher than he intended. Catherine assured him she was fine, her eyes fixed on the floor, her hands smoothing her apron in a nervous gesture. James nodded curtly, mumbled something about checking on the livestock, and retreated to the door with less dignity than he would have liked. As he strode toward the stables, his heart was pounding in a way that had nothing to do with physical exertion, and he realized with a mixture of wonder and dread that his carefully ordered life had just been irreversibly complicated by a pair of gray eyes and a smile he had glimpsed only briefly but could not seem to forget. That evening, dinner was served with the same efficiency as always, but the atmosphere had shifted in subtle ways that both parties felt acutely. James found himself watching Catherine as she moved about the dining room, noticing details he had previously overlooked. The grace with which she carried herself despite her humble station, the intelligence that flickered in her eyes when she thought no one was looking, the full curve of her lower lip that she occasionally caught between her teeth when concentrating. Catherine, for her part, was hyper-aware of his presence in a way that made her clumsy, nearly dropping a serving dish and spilling water as she refilled his glass. When their fingers accidentally brushed during the exchange, both jerked back as if burned, the air between them suddenly charged with an electricity that had nothing to do with the gathering thunderstorm outside. After the meal concluded, and Catherine had cleared the dishes, James retired to his study, but found himself unable to focus on the ranch accounts that normally commanded his complete attention, his mind repeatedly wandering to the woman working in the kitchen just down the hall. The days that followed saw a gradual shift in the dynamics of the household, as James and Catherine began to navigate a new and uncertain terrain. James found excuses to be in the house more often, claiming paperwork that needed attention or business correspondence that couldn't wait, when in truth, he simply wanted to be in Catherine's proximity. He began to engage her in conversation, asking about her day, her opinions on various matters, her thoughts on the books she had noticed in his library. Catherine responded tentatively at first, unsure if this attention was appropriate or if she was somehow overstepping boundaries by engaging in dialogue beyond what was strictly necessary for her duties. But James was patient and persistent, his questions genuine, his interest in her answers evident in the way he listened without interruption, nodding thoughtfully as she spoke. Slowly, Catherine began to relax in his presence, her natural intelligence and gentle humor emerging from beneath the protective shell she had built over years of disappointment and rejection. Winter arrived early that year, sweeping down from the mountains with fierce winds and heavy snow that transformed the landscape into a study in white and gray. The ranch hands moved the cattle to lower pastures and closer to the barns, where hay and feed could be more easily distributed, while James oversaw the operations with the practiced efficiency of a man who had weathered many Wyoming winters. Catherine found herself confined to the house more often as the weather turned brutal. Her daily routines adjusted to accommodate the shorter days and longer nights. She took to spending her evenings in the kitchen after dinner was served, darning socks and mending clothes by the light of an oil lamp, occasionally reading from the small collection of books that James had quietly left in her room with no explanation or expectation of thanks. The isolation of winter brought an unexpected intimacy to the household, as James and Catherine became increasingly comfortable in each other's company, their conversations extending beyond polite pleasantries to encompass deeper topics. Her memories of life before the orphanage, his dreams for expanding the ranch, shared opinions on the changing nature of the West as civilization slowly encroached upon the frontier. It was during one of these evening conversations, with snow falling heavily outside and a fire crackling in the hearth, that James made a decision that would alter both their lives forever. He had invited Catherine to join him in the parlor after dinner, an invitation that had surprised her, but which she had accepted with shy pleasure. They sat in companionable silence for a time, she with her mending and he with a book he wasn't really reading, before James set the book aside and cleared his throat. Catherine looked up, her needle pausing mid-stitch as she registered the serious expression on his face. What James said next was delivered without preamble or romantic flourish, his words blunt and honest in the manner of a man unused to emotional declarations. He told her that he had come to care for her deeply, that he recognized the impropriety of his feelings given their difference in age and station, but that he could no longer ignore the fact that she had brought light and warmth into a house that had been cold and empty for too long. He was offering her not a position as his housekeeper, but a place as his wife, if she would have him, though he would understand completely if she refused such an unexpected and possibly unwelcome proposition. Catherine sat frozen, her mending forgotten in her lap as she processed what she had just heard. Her first instinct was disbelief, a certainty that she had misunderstood or that this was some cruel jest, though James Garrett had never been anything but kind and honorable in all their interactions. Her second thought was of the vast gulf that separated them. He was a wealthy rancher, respected throughout the territory, while she was nobody, an orphan with no family, no education beyond the basics, no dowry or connections to recommend her. What could a man like James Garrett possibly want with someone like her beyond what she already provided as his employee? But as she met his eyes across the small distance that separated them, Catherine saw something that made her heart stutter in her chest. Vulnerability, hope, and something that looked very much like love, offered freely without demands or expectations. For the first time in her life, Catherine felt truly seen, not as a burden or a servant or a charity case, but as a woman worthy of desire and respect, and the realization brought tears to her eyes that she quickly blinked away. The silence stretched between them as Catherine struggled to find words adequate to the moment. She thought of all the years she had spent invisible, moving through other people's homes like a ghost, never daring to hope for anything beyond survival. She thought of the loneliness that had been her constant companion since childhood, the ache of never belonging anywhere or to anyone. And she thought of James Garrett, this strong, successful man who had somehow looked past all her deficiencies to see something worth wanting. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper, but her words were clear. She would be honored to be his wife, if he truly meant what he said, and this wasn't some fever dream brought on by the isolation of winter. James rose from his chair and crossed to where she sat, taking her work-roughened hands in his own and assuring her that he had never been more certain of anything in his life. They would be married as soon as the weather cleared enough for the pastor to make the journey from town, and in the meantime, propriety would be maintained, with Catherine remaining in her quarters, and Mrs. Patterson, the ranch foreman's wife, invited to stay in the house as chaperone. The news of the engagement spread through the ranch community like wildfire, generating reactions that ranged from genuine happiness to skeptical surprise. The ranch hands, who had observed James Garrett's transformation over recent months, were largely supportive, recognizing that their employer had finally found some measure of happiness after years of grim solitude. Pastor Williams, when informed of the upcoming nuptials, expressed his wholehearted approval, having long hoped that James might find companionship again, and pleased that Catherine would be so well provided for. But there were others in town who viewed the match with suspicion and disdain, whispering that the orphan girl had obviously set her cap for the wealthy rancher, using feminine wiles to trap a lonely man into an unsuitable marriage. Mrs. Thornton, the banker's wife and self-appointed arbiter of Cheyenne society, made her disapproval known by loudly declaring that she would not receive such a person in her home, setting off a minor scandal that threatened to overshadow what should have been a joyous occasion. Catherine heard the whispers and felt the sting of judgment from people who had never bothered to learn her name before she became engaged to James Garrett. She held her head high and went about her preparations with quiet dignity, refusing to give the gossips the satisfaction of seeing her distressed. James, for his part, made his position clear to anyone who cared to listen. Catherine Morgan was to be his wife and the mistress of the Triple Crown Ranch, and anyone who could not treat her with appropriate respect would find themselves unwelcome on his property or in his business dealings. His fierce protectiveness both touched and worried Catherine, who feared that his defense of her might damage relationships he had spent years cultivating. But James was unmoved by such concerns, telling her firmly that any relationship based on snobbery and prejudice was not worth preserving, and that she would soon learn that true friends revealed themselves in times of challenge, not comfort. The wedding took place on a clear February morning when the sun shone brilliantly on snow-covered fields, and the air was crisp enough to make breath visible. Pastor Williams performed the ceremony in the parlor of the ranch house, with Mrs. Patterson and several of the ranch hands serving as witnesses. Catherine wore a simple but elegant dress of dove-gray wool that Mrs. Patterson had helped her sew, her copper hair arranged in soft waves that framed her face. James stood beside her in his best suit, his weathered face solemn as he spoke his vows with conviction and clarity. When the pastor pronounced them man and wife, James kissed his bride gently, reverently, as if she were something precious that might break. The small gathering erupted in applause and well-wishes, and for the first time in her life, Catherine felt like she truly belonged somewhere, anchored not by duty or charity, but by love freely given and gratefully received. The early months of marriage brought adjustments for both James and Catherine as they learned to navigate their new relationship. Catherine struggled to transition from servant to mistress of the house, still inclined to rise before dawn to start breakfast, until James gently insisted that they hire a cook and housekeeper to handle such duties. She found herself with time and leisure that she had never experienced before, free to read, to learn, to simply exist without constantly working. James encouraged her to order books from Denver, to furnish the house according to her preferences, to accompany him on trips to town, where he introduced her as his wife with unmistakable pride. Slowly, Catherine began to shed the protective invisibility she had cultivated for so long, allowing herself to hope and dream and plan for a future that stretched before her, with possibilities she had never dared imagine. But their happiness was not without challenges, as James soon discovered that integrating Catherine into his social circles would require more than simple declarations of intent. Mrs. Thornton's initial snub had set a precedent that several other society matrons followed, resulting in Catherine being excluded from various social functions and charitable organizations that the wives of wealthy ranchers were expected to join. James watched with growing anger as his wife was subjected to subtle and sometimes not so subtle slights, from being accidentally left off invitation lists to being seated at the end of the table during gatherings they did attend, positioned as far from the hostess as possible. Catherine bore these insults with grace, refusing to let the petty cruelties of small-minded people diminish her joy in her marriage. But James could see the hurt that flickered in her eyes when she thought he wasn't looking, and it ignited a protective fury that demanded action. The opportunity for that action came in early spring, when the town council announced plans for a grand charity ball to raise funds for a new schoolhouse. James was approached to serve as one of the primary sponsors, given his wealth and standing in the community, an honor that would have been automatically accepted in previous years. Instead, James made his agreement conditional. He would sponsor the event and double his usual contribution, but only if Catherine was included on the organizing committee and treated with the same respect afforded to any other sponsor's wife. His ultimatum sent ripples through Cheyenne's social hierarchy, forcing the town's leading ladies to choose between their prejudices and their practical need for James Garrett's financial support. After much behind-the-scenes maneuvering and grudging negotiation, a compromise was reached. Catherine would be included on the committee, though in what Mrs. Thornton sniffily described as a junior capacity. Catherine approached her first committee meeting with trepidation, fully expecting to be ignored or patronized by the established women of Cheyenne society. She dressed carefully in a new gown of deep blue silk that James had insisted on purchasing for her in Denver, her hair arranged in a fashionable style copied from a ladies' magazine. As she entered Mrs. Thornton's formal parlor, she was greeted by a sea of faces that ranged from curious to openly hostile, with only Mrs. Patterson offering a warm smile of support. The meeting began with Mrs. Thornton outlining the vision for the ball, speaking in the sort of overly refined accent that suggested pretensions above her actual station. When she finished and opened the floor for suggestions, there was a long, uncomfortable silence as the other ladies waited to see how Catherine would embarrass herself, their expressions a mixture of anticipation and malicious glee. Catherine took a deep breath and began to speak, her voice clear and steady despite the nervous flutter in her stomach. She suggested that rather than the typical format of a dance followed by a late supper, they might consider incorporating entertainment that would appeal to families, including a children's program earlier in the evening and an art auction featuring works by local artists. The funds raised could be divided between the schoolhouse and a scholarship fund for students who couldn't afford supplies or books. As Catherine spoke, outlining her ideas with thoughtful detail and practical considerations, she could see the expressions around the room shifting from condescension to surprise to grudging interest. Even Mrs. Thornton was forced to admit that the suggestions had merit, though she phrased her approval in the most backhanded manner possible. By the time the meeting concluded, Catherine had secured responsibility for organizing the children's program and coordinating with local artists, tasks that the other ladies were happy to delegate as they involved actual work rather than. She visited the schoolhouse to speak with the teachers about appropriate entertainment for children, consulted with James about which ranchers and businessmen might be interested in donating artwork, and personally called on several local artists to discuss their participation in the auction. Her genuine enthusiasm and practical approach won over many of the people she worked with, and word began to spread that James Garrett's young wife was not the gold-digging schemer some had assumed, but rather an intelligent, hard-working woman who genuinely cared about improving her community. Slowly but surely, Catherine began to win acceptance, not through grand gestures or social maneuvering, but through quiet competence and sincere kindness that reflected the values of the frontier itself. Judge people by their actions, not their origins. The night of the charity ball arrived with perfect spring weather, the air warm enough for the doors and windows of the community hall to be thrown open, while still cool enough for ladies' evening gowns and gentlemen's formal wear. Catherine had worked tirelessly to ensure that every detail of the children's program and art auction was perfect. From the painted backdrop for the children's theatrical performance to the elegant display of artwork in the side gallery. As guests began to arrive, resplendent in their finest clothes, Catherine stood beside James at the entrance, greeting each arrival with poise that would have made a duchess proud. She wore a gown of emerald silk that brought out the green flecks in her gray eyes, her copper hair swept up to reveal the pearl necklace that had been James's wedding gift. And more than one gentleman remarked quietly to his wife that Garrett had chosen well, whatever her origins might be. The children's program was a triumph, with a chorus of young voices singing folk songs, followed by a short play about the founding of Cheyenne that featured costumes Catherine had helped sew. The audience applauded enthusiastically, parents beaming with pride at their offspring's performance. The art auction that followed raised more money than anyone had anticipated, with James himself purchasing 3 paintings at prices well above their appraised value, a gesture that inspired other wealthy ranchers to open their wallets with equal generosity. By the time the dancing began, with a small orchestra imported from Denver providing music, the atmosphere in the hall was one of genuine celebration rather than stiff formality. Catherine danced first with James, who moved with surprising grace for such a large man, and then with several other gentlemen who requested the honor, including the mayor himself, who praised her organizational skills and suggested she might consider joining the town's planning commission. As the evening progressed, Catherine found herself in conversation with several of the ladies who had initially snubbed her, women who now seemed eager to include her in their discussions of fashion, books, and local gossip. Thornton remained coolly distant, but even she was forced to acknowledge Catherine's success in organizing her portion of the event, delivering a stiff compliment that sounded like it physically pained her to utter. Catherine accepted the praise with gracious humility, knowing that she had achieved something rare on the frontier. She had proven herself worthy, not through lineage or connections, but through character and capability. When she caught James's eye across the crowded room, she saw pride and love reflected there, and felt a surge of gratitude for the man who had given her not just security and status, but the opportunity to discover her own worth and potential. The success of the charity ball marked a turning point in Catherine's acceptance by Cheyenne society, but it was events later that summer that would truly test the strength of her marriage and her integration into frontier life. A severe drought struck the region, withering grass and drying up streams that normally provided water for livestock. James spent long days riding the ranch's vast acreage, assessing the damage and making difficult decisions about which cattle to sell before they lost too much weight to fetch decent prices. The stress showed in the lines around his eyes and the tension in his shoulders. But Catherine proved herself invaluable during this crisis, managing the household accounts with careful efficiency, organizing meals for the exhausted ranch hands, and providing emotional support to a man who was watching years of careful planning threatened by forces beyond his control. It was during the height of the drought that word reached the Triple Crown Ranch of trouble brewing in town. A group of newcomers had arrived in Cheyenne, led by a man named Samuel Blackwood, who claimed to represent Eastern investors interested in purchasing large tracts of grazing land. Blackwood made the rounds of the established ranchers, making offers that seemed generous on the surface, but which James immediately recognized as attempts to take advantage of men desperate for cash during the drought. When James refused to sell any portion of the Triple Crown, Blackwood's charm evaporated, replaced by thinly veiled threats about the dangers of being uncooperative in business. James, who had not built his empire by being intimidated, showed Blackwood the door and warned him not to return. But the encounter left him uneasy about the man's intentions and methods. Catherine first encountered Samuel Blackwood on a trip to town to purchase supplies and check on mail delivery. She was emerging from the general store, her arms full of packages, when a well-dressed man in a tailored suit stepped into her path, tipping his hat with exaggerated courtesy. He introduced himself with oily charm, expressing great pleasure at finally meeting the famous Mrs. Garrett, whose beauty and accomplishments were the talk of the territory. Catherine's instincts, honed by years of navigating dangerous situations as a vulnerable orphan, immediately warned her that this man was not to be trusted. She responded with cool politeness, attempting to step around him, but Blackwood persisted, making subtle inquiries about her husband's financial situation and whether the drought might make him reconsider his position on selling land. Catherine cut the conversation short with icy civility, but the encounter left her shaken and determined to warn James about Blackwood's continued interest in the Triple Crown. That evening, Catherine related the encounter to James over dinner, watching as his jaw tightened and his eyes grew hard with anger. He thanked her for the information and warned her to avoid Blackwood in the future, explaining that the man's type preyed on weakness and would not hesitate to use any means necessary to achieve his goals. Catherine nodded her understanding, but privately she began to worry about the escalating tension and what it might mean for their family and the ranch. Her concerns proved prescient when 2 days later, one of the ranch's most productive wells was found to have been sabotaged, its pump mechanism deliberately damaged in a way that would take days to repair and leave an entire section of cattle without easy access to water during the height of summer heat. James immediately suspected Blackwood's involvement, though proving it would be nearly impossible without witnesses or physical evidence linking the Eastern man to the crime. He increased security around the ranch, posting guards at key locations and warning his hands to be vigilant for any suspicious activity. The atmosphere at the Triple Crown grew tense, with everyone on edge, and the normally cheerful banter of the ranch hands replaced by grim determination to protect what was theirs. Catherine did her best to maintain normalcy in the household, but she could feel the weight of worry pressing down on James. Could see it in the way he stood at the windows late at night, watching the darkness beyond the lamplight, as if expecting enemies to emerge from the shadows. The crisis came to a head on a sweltering August afternoon when Catherine was returning from a visit to the Patterson cabin, where she had been teaching literacy to Mrs. Patterson's youngest children. She was riding the gentle mare that James had given her, accompanied by Thomas, one of the younger ranch hands assigned to ensure her safety. As they approached a narrow canyon that provided a shortcut back to the main house, Catherine's horse suddenly reared in fear, nearly throwing her from the saddle. Thomas dismounted quickly, investigating the trail ahead, and discovered that someone had strung a wire across the path at neck height, positioned perfectly to decapitate an unsuspecting rider. If Catherine's mare hadn't been so skittish, sensing the danger with animal instinct, the trap would likely have killed her. Thomas cut down the wire with shaking hands and escorted Catherine back to the ranch house at a gallop, both of them understanding that this was no longer about business pressure or property disputes, but a direct threat to Catherine's life. James's reaction to the news was volcanic, his normally controlled demeanor shattering into white-hot fury that had every ranch hand in the vicinity stepping back cautiously. He organized an immediate search party to hunt for whoever had set the trap, sending riders out in all directions with instructions to check every inch of the ranch's extensive boundaries. Then he called for his horse and his Winchester rifle, intent on riding into town to confront Samuel Blackwood directly. Consequences be damned. Catherine, still shaken but determined, placed herself physically between James and the door, her small frame somehow immovable despite the difference in their sizes. She spoke urgently, reminding him that going after Blackwood without proof would only play into the man's hands, making James look like the aggressor and possibly putting him on the wrong side of the law. She begged him to think strategically rather than emotionally, to protect her and the ranch by being smart rather than just strong. Her words penetrated James's rage, and he forced himself to take several deep breaths, his fists gradually unclenching as reason reasserted itself. He pulled Catherine into a fierce embrace, his voice rough with suppressed emotion as he swore that he would keep her safe, no matter what it took. Catherine held him tightly, realizing fully for the first time just how deep his feelings for her ran, understanding that she had become the center of his world in a way that both humbled and frightened her. When they finally separated, James's eyes were still hard, but his expression had shifted from uncontrolled fury to calculated determination. He would deal with Blackwood, but he would do it the right way, using the law and community pressure to expose the man's criminal activities rather than resorting to frontier justice that might ultimately harm more than help. The next morning, James rode into town with Catherine beside him, both of them dressed formally for a visit to the sheriff's office. They brought with them the wire from the canyon trap, along with sworn statements from Thomas and several other ranch hands who had witnessed suspicious riders near the ranch's boundaries in recent weeks. Sheriff Morrison, a grizzled veteran of frontier law enforcement, listened to their account with growing concern, his expression darkening as he examined the evidence. He agreed that the situation warranted investigation, but cautioned that without witnesses placing Blackwood or his men at the scene of the sabotage, prosecution would be difficult. James had anticipated this response and had come prepared with an alternative strategy. He intended to call a meeting of the Cattlemen's Association, presenting evidence of Blackwood's intimidation tactics and criminal activities to the assembled ranchers and business owners who formed the backbone of the territory's economy. The meeting of the Cattlemen's Association took place 3 days later in the largest room at the Cheyenne Hotel, with every major rancher within 100 miles in attendance. James took the floor and laid out a methodical case against Samuel Blackwood, detailing the pattern of threats, suspicious offers to purchase land, and culminating in the attack on Catherine that could have resulted in her death. He passed around the wire from the trap, allowing each man to examine it and draw his own conclusions about the malicious intent behind its placement. As James spoke, several other ranchers came forward with their own stories of pressure from Blackwood's organization, painting a picture of systematic intimidation aimed at forcing land sales through fear and violence. The mood in the room grew increasingly hostile toward Blackwood, with calls for immediate action ranging from legal prosecution to more direct frontier justice. It was Catherine who proposed the solution that ultimately carried the day. She stood and addressed the assembled ranchers, her voice clear, despite the butterflies in her stomach at speaking before such a distinguished group. She suggested that rather than resorting to violence or lengthy legal proceedings that Blackwood's Eastern lawyers might be able to manipulate, they should instead make Cheyenne and the surrounding territory so inhospitable to Blackwood's business that he would have no choice but to leave. Every business owner should refuse to sell supplies to Blackwood or his men. Every hotel and boarding house should turn them away. Every rancher should spread the word throughout the territory about Blackwood's methods, ensuring that no one would be willing to do business with him. In essence, they would shun Blackwood out of Wyoming using the same social pressure that frontier communities had always employed against those who violated the unwritten codes of honor and decency. The proposal was met with enthusiastic approval, and within days, Samuel Blackwood found himself persona non grata throughout the territory. He could not buy food or lodging, could not hire workers or rent facilities, could not conduct business of any kind, as word spread of his attempted murder of Catherine Garrett. His carefully cultivated image as a respectable businessman crumbled in the face of frontier solidarity. And within 2 weeks, Blackwood and his entire operation packed up and left Wyoming, knowing that they had been thoroughly defeated, not by violence or legal maneuvering, but by the community's unified rejection of their methods. James watched them depart with grim satisfaction, his arm around Catherine's waist as they stood on the porch of the ranch house, looking out over land that would remain in Garrett hands for generations to come. The resolution of the Blackwood crisis cemented Catherine's position, not just as James Garrett's wife, but as a respected member of the community in her own right. Her quick thinking and strategic approach had won admiration from ranchers who valued cleverness and practical problem-solving over empty social posturing. Invitations began arriving with greater frequency, and Catherine found herself consulted on various matters, ranging from organizing community events to advising on domestic disputes that required a woman's perspective. She had achieved something remarkable. She had earned respect and belonging through her own merit, not merely through her marriage, and the realization filled her with a confidence she had never before possessed. As summer faded into autumn, and the drought finally broke with a series of thunderstorms that brought life-giving rain to the parched land, James and Catherine settled into a rhythm of life that felt both comfortable and exciting. The ranch prospered under James's experienced management, and Catherine's increasingly valuable input on matters ranging from household economy to community relations. They developed patterns and traditions, small rituals that bound them together. Morning coffee on the porch, watching the sunrise over the mountains. Evening walks through the grounds, discussing the day's events. Sunday dinners with the ranch's extended family of workers and their families. Catherine discovered that she had a talent for hospitality, transforming the Triple Crown Ranch House into a gathering place where people felt welcomed and valued, regardless of their station or background. Winter returned, gentler this year, and with it came news that Catherine was expecting a child. James received the information with a joy so profound it seemed to radiate from him like physical light. His weathered face, transformed by a smile that made him look years younger. He became almost comically protective, insisting that Catherine rest more, eat more, avoid any activity that might pose the slightest risk to her health or that of their unborn child. Catherine bore his fussing with amused patience, understanding that his concern came from love and the memory of losing Eleanor years ago. She assured him repeatedly that women had been having babies on the frontier since time immemorial, and that she was strong and healthy and perfectly capable of carrying their child to term without wrapping herself in cotton wool for the duration. The pregnancy progressed smoothly through the winter months, and Catherine found herself preparing not just for the arrival of a child, but for the continuation of a legacy. She sorted through Eleanor's belongings with James's permission, finding beautiful baby clothes carefully packed away in a cedar chest. And she wept at the thought of the woman she had never met, who had occupied this same house, loved this same man, and hoped for children that never came. Catherine felt no jealousy toward Eleanor's memory. Instead, she felt a kinship with her predecessor, a sense that she was fulfilling dreams that had been cut tragically short. She spoke sometimes to Eleanor's photograph on the mantel, telling the sepia-toned image about her daily life, her hopes for the baby, her gratitude for the home and husband that Eleanor had created before her death. Spring arrived with the promise of new beginnings, and on a warm April morning, with meadowlarks singing outside the bedroom window, Catherine gave birth to a healthy baby girl. James was present, despite the midwife's protestations that childbirth was no place for men, refusing to be separated from his wife during such a momentous event. He held Catherine's hand through the long hours of labor, offering support and encouragement. And when the baby finally arrived with a lusty cry that announced her arrival to the entire household, tears streamed unashamedly down his weathered cheeks. They named her Eleanor Catherine Garrett, honoring both the past and the present. And as James cradled his daughter for the first time, he looked at Catherine with such love and gratitude that she felt her heart might burst from the fullness of it. The months that followed were filled with the organized chaos of life with an infant, as Catherine learned the rhythms of motherhood, and James discovered the joys of fatherhood at an age when most men were becoming grandfathers. Little Eleanor, Ellie as she quickly became known, proved to be a spirited child with her mother's copper hair and her father's strong will. She was passed around among the ranch hands like a precious treasure, with weathered cowboys who had faced stampedes and winter blizzards, rendered helpless by her toothless smile. The ranch house that had been silent for so many years now rang with the sounds of life, a baby's laughter, a mother's lullabies, a father's proud boasts about his daughter's obvious genius and beauty. Catherine often found herself pausing in her daily activities to simply marvel at how drastically her life had changed. From the invisible orphan scrubbing floors, she had become the beloved wife of a respected rancher and the mother of a beautiful daughter. She had found not just security and comfort, but purpose and belonging, a place in the world where she was valued and cherished for exactly who she was. The scars of her difficult childhood remained, but they no longer defined her. Instead, they served as reminders of how far she had come and how much she had overcome. She thought sometimes of the other children from the orphan train, wondering if they had found their own happy endings or if they were still searching for a place to belong. As Ellie grew from infant to toddler, James began making long-term plans for the ranch's future, determined to build something that would sustain his family for generations. He worked with lawyers in Denver to ensure that the property would pass directly to Ellie, with Catherine having full control and management authority until their daughter came of age. He established accounts for Ellie's education, intending that she would have opportunities that frontier children rarely received, including the possibility of attending a fine school back east if she showed academic inclination. Catherine listened to these plans with a mixture of gratitude and amusement, teasing James gently about planning their daughter's entire life before she had even learned to walk properly. But she understood his need to secure their future, to ensure that the family he had built so late in life would be protected and provided for, no matter what happened. The years passed with the steady rhythm of ranch life, marked by the changing seasons and the annual cattle drives that took the Triple Crown's herds to market. Catherine grew into her role as ranch matriarch, managing a household that seemed to expand constantly as James hired more hands and built additional structures to accommodate the operation's growth. She oversaw the education of ranch children, organized social gatherings that brought the scattered frontier community together, and continued her charitable work in town, now as one of the leading ladies of Cheyenne society, rather than the outsider looking in. Her friendship with the other ranchers' wives deepened as they recognized in her a kindred spirit who understood the challenges of frontier life and the strength required to thrive in such demanding circumstances. Ellie grew into a bright, curious child who seemed equally comfortable in her mother's kitchen, learning to bake bread, and out in the corrals, watching the cowboys work with the horses. She followed her father around the ranch like a shadow, asking endless questions about cattle breeding, grass management, and the business of ranching. James answered every question with patience and obvious delight, already grooming his daughter to eventually take over the operation he had spent his life building. Catherine watched their interactions with tender amusement, seeing in her daughter's determined independence a reflection of both her parents' strong wills, and knowing that Ellie would never be constrained by conventional expectations about what women could or should do. On Ellie's 5th birthday, James organized a celebration that brought together friends from across the territory, transforming the ranch into a festival ground with games, food, and entertainment. As Catherine looked out over the assembled crowd, ranch hands and their families, business associates from town, friends who had stood by them through various challenges, she was struck by the realization that she had helped build this community, had contributed to creating a place where people felt welcomed and valued. The invisible orphan, who had once believed herself unworthy of notice, had become a woman of substance and influence, not through marriage alone, but through her own efforts and character. As the sun set on that perfect spring day, painting the Wyoming sky in shades of pink and gold, James found Catherine standing alone on the porch, watching their daughter play with the other children on the lawn. He came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist in a gesture that had become familiar over the years. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment before James spoke, his voice rough with emotion, as he told her that she had given him something he thought he would never have again: a family, a purpose, a future filled with hope rather than just memories. Catherine leaned back against him, covering his weathered hands with her own, and replied that he had given her something equally precious: the chance to discover who she really was beneath the survival instincts and defense mechanisms, the opportunity to bloom into her full potential. The years continued to pass, bringing the usual mixture of joys and challenges that defined frontier life. There were lean years when cattle prices dropped, and Catherine's careful management of household accounts kept the ranch afloat. There were bountiful years when nature cooperated and the Triple Crown prospered beyond expectation. There were births and deaths within their extended ranch family, marriages and departures as young people grew up and sought their own fortunes. Through it all, James and Catherine remained partners in every sense of the word, facing each challenge together and celebrating each success as a shared victory. James aged gracefully into his 60s and then 70s, his hair turning silver, but his mind remaining sharp and his love for Catherine undiminished by time. He often told people that marrying Catherine was the smartest business decision he had ever made, though everyone knew he was only half joking. Her contributions to the ranch's success and their family's happiness were undeniable and immeasurable. Catherine watched the passage of time with philosophical acceptance, grateful for every day she had with the man who had seen her worth when no one else had, who had offered her not just security, but genuine love and partnership. Ellie grew into a remarkable young woman, educated by tutors imported from Denver and refined by her mother's gentle guidance, but never losing the grit and determination that were her inheritance from both parents. She took an active role in ranch management by her late teens, proving herself capable of matching any man in the territory when it came to business acumen and practical horse sense. When suitors began to appear at the ranch gates, drawn by Ellie's beauty, intelligence, and substantial inheritance, she evaluated each one with a critical eye that would have made her father proud, ultimately choosing a young rancher from Montana whose values aligned with her own and who saw her as a partner rather than a prize. On the day of Ellie's wedding, held at the Triple Crown Ranch with half the territory in attendance, Catherine stood beside James as they watched their daughter exchange vows with her chosen husband. James's eyes were suspiciously bright, and Catherine squeezed his hand in understanding, sharing his bittersweet emotions at this milestone. Their little girl was beginning her own journey, carrying forward the values and legacy they had worked so hard to build. But this was not an ending, Catherine reflected. It was a continuation, a new chapter in a story that had begun years ago, when a wealthy rancher had looked past social conventions to see the worth in an orphan girl scrubbing his floors. As the wedding celebration wound down and guests began departing for their long journeys home, James and Catherine slipped away to their favorite spot on the porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of purple and gold. They sat in companionable silence, hands clasped, reflecting on the unlikely journey that had brought them to this moment. Catherine thought of the girl she had been, invisible, frightened, convinced of her own insignificance, and marveled at the transformation that love and opportunity had wrought. She thought of all the children still waiting in orphanages and on orphan trains, hoping for someone to see their potential and offer them a chance at a better life. James, as if reading her thoughts, suggested that perhaps they should investigate sponsoring some of those children, bringing them west to the ranch where they could learn trades and skills that would serve them well in life. Catherine turned to him with tears in her eyes, loving him even more for understanding what such a project would mean to her, for his willingness to extend the second chance he had given her to others who desperately needed it. They began planning immediately, discussing how many children they could reasonably accommodate, what structures would need to be built, what arrangements would need to be made for education and training. The years that followed saw the Triple Crown Ranch become known throughout the territory, not just for its successful cattle operation, but for its program of taking in orphans and training them in useful skills. Catherine personally oversaw the selection and care of each child, ensuring that they received not just practical training, but also the emotional support and guidance that she had so desperately needed in her own youth. Many of these children eventually became valued members of the ranch operation, while others moved on to establish their own homes and businesses throughout the West, carrying with them the values and work ethic they had learned at the Triple Crown. James lived to the remarkable age of 82, remaining active in ranch management almost until the end, finally passing peacefully in his sleep, with Catherine holding his hand and Ellie keeping vigil at his bedside. The funeral drew mourners from across Wyoming and beyond, a testament to the respect and affection he had earned over a lifetime of fair dealing and honorable conduct. Catherine grieved deeply for the man who had been her husband, partner, and greatest advocate for over 30 years, but she did not break under the weight of loss. She carried on, managing the ranch with the same competence she had always shown, ensuring that James's legacy continued through their daughter and the many young people they had helped over the years. In her later years, Catherine became something of a legend in the territory, the woman who had risen from nothing to become one of the most respected figures in Wyoming society. Young women sought her advice on navigating social expectations while maintaining personal integrity. Aspiring ranchers consulted her on business matters. Orphans and vulnerable children found in her a fierce advocate and protector. She never forgot where she had come from or lost touch with the humility that had been forged in those difficult early years. And she used her influence and resources to create opportunities for others who faced the same challenges she had once overcome. Catherine lived to see her grandchildren grow to adulthood, carrying forward the Garrett name and the values she and James had worked so hard to instill. She watched the West continue its transformation from wild frontier to settled territory, seeing both the losses and gains that came with civilization's advance. And on quiet evenings, she would sit on the porch of the Triple Crown Ranch House, now surrounded by the laughter of great-grandchildren, and marvel at the improbable journey that had brought her from invisible orphan to beloved matriarch of one of Wyoming's most respected families. If you liked this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions of this story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the left.